I'm here with an amazing panel of panelists. We have Ben Troop, we have Eka, we have Holden Link, we have Teresa Duringer. I'm Samantha Kalman, and the way this format works, it's kind of a little special. Each slide is on a 30-second timer, and these slides are auto-advancing. So we're going to try to cram as much sweet VR info as we can into these auto-advancing slides with really no pressure for us up here. We're just trying to keep up with our own notes. So with that in mind, I am going to jump right in. Again, as I said, I'm Samantha Kalman, and I want to talk about impossible spaces. I just reverted to a real indie, which means nights and weekends after a couple of years doing full-time development. And since I've been looking more at VR game development as kind of artistic explorations, I found impossible spaces to be really fascinating. And I mean, let's talk about impossible spaces, shall we? As a game designer, I'm most known for this game, Centris. It's a puzzle game that gamifies the process of composing and performing music. Turns out this is a very hard problem to solve for a variety of reasons. People get intimidated when you ask them to be musically creative, which is fair. Making music is hard, and the bar is very high. The game needed systems that simplify a very complex domain of possibility, playing an instrument by repeatedly pressing one button. Learning to play music is also very personal, so the systems needed to be friendly and support the player's own journey. For these reasons, I designed Centris to be an icon, an enchanted object, a symbol that lives on the screen. The player lives in this world and has a relationship with this digital instrument game, and that's it. Except, when I first tried Centris on Gear VR, I realized I just stepped inside a world that I'd built unintentionally. That first build was so broken. I was using multiple cameras with different assets at different orientations. The sky was sideways and the ground was missing. Part of the world was very far away, tiny, floating, and upside down. All the seams that I'd carefully masked for the 2D illusion were revealed. It was broken. Even though everything felt wrong, it still carried a cohesion of presence in the world. Something about it worked, and I became really interested in this dichotomy. The impossible becoming possible. I started wondering, what is the extent of impossibility that our lizard brains can be tricked into accepting as possible? And as an artist, how can I express myself and my feelings about this world by creating a world that logically shouldn't exist, but does? I'm new to this whole being an artist thing, so I started by looking for low-hanging fruit. Primitives, lines, draw calls, colored lighting, transparencies, backface culling, bitmaps. If our virtual realities are conveyed through 3D graphics, what could I learn from exploring the fundamentals of the medium? This research, focusing on visuals and presence, was a much-needed mental break from the complex systems and audio required to make Centris. Over time, objects became spaces, suggesting the familiar while abstracting it. Embracing the uncanny valley, breaking expectations of scale, motion, and input response. I was also working within the constraints of mobile VR, which afford for look direction, but not head tracking. When you can't look around an object, how do you keep it interesting to look at? I started working with line rendering to explore an emerging interest in sacred geometry. There's an unrelatable purity to sacred geometry, and most of us can only imagine it in 2D. Even architects are trained to conceive and visualize complex 3D physical spaces on 2D screens and drawings. Once we can observe a vector floating in front of us, our relationship to the abstract numbers it represents fundamentally changes. I became slightly obsessed with scaffoldings. To me, they're the closest representation of abstract geometrical structure that we have in our world. Lines connecting lines, connecting lines. They can be quite dense and vertically vast. They also serve a functional purpose. They are structures utilized to create other structures. Building a building requires a scaffolding. They're somewhat abstract as structures, but with a purpose that isn't fully revealed until they're no longer needed. From my time playing with graphics fundamentals, I realized scaffoldings have a metaphor in VR: triangles. All geometry in VR is made up of triangles. With line rendering, I could expose the inherent structures of the virtual world that surrounds you. It's kind of like seeing an atom in this world. In VR, we have the opportunity to observe the impossible, the literal structure of a world, the data structure. It's the VR equivalent of atoms. It reveals data in a way that's more familiar to the GPU than to humans. And in this way, that makes us want to touch it. It becomes possible. This is Project Red, and it's an experimental game about moving through a world made of lines. While working on Red, I discovered affine planes. Now I have 30 seconds to describe affine planes to you. They're non-Euclidean. They are an abstract set of rules that can be used to describe the relationships between lines. It's a framework or a law of sorts. They're mathematical logic that's most visualizable with line rendering. And affine planes can describe affine spaces, which are an additional abstraction about how lines and points relate to each other. Any 2 points in an affine space can be connected by a line. Any 2 lines will always intersect somewhere on the plane. To get technical, in an affine plane, given a line L and a point P on line L, there exists exactly one line through P that is parallel to L. An affine plane of order n has n2 points and n2 plus n lines, with n points on each line and n plus 1 lines on each point. This is a phanoplane. In a phanoplane, every point corresponds to a line and vice versa. This diagram illustrates a characteristic that phanoplanes share with affine planes. Any given line will intersect with another line once. Some really beautiful shapes can emerge from this logic, but you can see it's in our brains it's kind of a little muddy, like, what does this look like when it's not on paper? VR. I discovered a characteristic of line rendering that creates an optical illusion. Every line is 1 pixel wide, rendered in each eye, regardless of how far away it is. They defy perspective. In a purely line-rendered world, only half the phenomenon of perspective applies. It's a real way of observing the impossibility of a world that does not conform to our reality. I don't mean to get heavy here or like to go there, but I'm gonna. If creating worlds in VR, we're actually creating worlds. To me, that's as close as we are gonna get to becoming a god as any of us will ever experience. So once we can put on a headset and step inside the fictional worlds we create, are they still fictional? I'm not really sure. So now I'm in the process of exploring a balance. Worlds that feel unfamiliar but comfortable at the same time, and the role of geometry in creating a sense of tangible impossibility, reminding my players that they're in a special place and that anything could happen. I think we all know that it's hard to depict VR using 2D screens, but this is just a little step toward VR-centrist explorations that I'm playing with. Now, I want to leave you considering the unexplainable, unexpected possibilities of the limits of our imaginations. If impossible spaces are made by breaking the rules of reality, and if observing impossible worlds from within them makes them feel more tangible, what are all the amazing things we can do with that power? I hope that you'll all want to go down the rabbit hole with me. So please, send me all your impossible worlds. I want to go exist in all of them and observe them. And thank you very much. Please contact me. And I'm going to hand it over now to Ben Troop, who's going to say some amazing things about his time exploring Headmaster. Ben?
Hi, everybody. So I think that it's interesting that my talk is actually going to be about very possible spaces. Samantha has really given you a good overview of what it's like to get into the unreal stuff, but this is really more about keeping things real. So my name's Ben Troop. I'm the founder of indie studio Frame Interactive, and I'm currently working on a VR title called Headmaster. Headmaster introduces a new VR-only mechanic of heading virtual soccer balls with your actual head. Like you see Chat from Valve doing there. He's playing a prototype that I did at a game jam in Boston in 2014. And while the mechanic is fun, the immersive environment that surrounds it is what makes the title stand out. So today I'm going to talk about 4 principles that we've used to build immersion in this game. When we onboard people for a demo, we say, you're a professional soccer player who had a bad season. So your club sent you to the Football Improvement Center, which is not a prison. Wrapping this odd setting around the mechanic has worked out. Last year, after GDC, Headmaster was signed by Sony as a PlayStation VR exclusive, and it's been shown at E3, PAX, and PSX. Here at GDC, we'll have a brand new build in Sony's PlayStation VR area. So here's a quick intro to the game.
Center. Due to your recent performance, your club has enrolled you in a compulsory session here in our heading facility. During your stay, you will undergo increasingly challenging rounds of heading re-education.
So in the process of building this game, we've honed in on these development principles that strengthen immersion for the player. We check in on these items as we build features in Headmaster, but there are principles that could be valuable for any small team looking to make a convincing gameplay space in VR while controlling scope. So I'll step through each one and talk about some details and share examples. And the first thing I want to talk about is restraint, starting in a broader context. So this is how video games feel to me sometimes. I get it, and I know how all this came to be. Genres have formed and players are sophisticated, and we're building on a lot of experience and history. So it's not surprising that games look and feel complex. But not only do I want restraint and minimalism in my work, this kind of stuff just won't fly in VR right now. We need to figure out what works, and we need to reduce scope while we do it so we can go fast. So we need a different model that gives us permission to do less. I believe instead of looking to video games, the real world can be a much more reliable template for success in VR. In the real world, we have busy spaces and we have empty spaces, but how believable and compelling an experience is not proportional to the complexity of a scene. In fact, we find that in the real world, we tend to get overwhelmed easily, and that is also true in VR. So not only can we have restraint, we should. The players respond positively once they experience it in VR. So we must execute fully on everything we attempt, or omit the feature. As an example of how this form of restraint worked in our favor, I originally thought, okay, we're heading soccer balls, I have to have a stadium. So I thought about wasting all of that performance on the background and just ended up cheaping out by making it nighttime on an empty field. And this decision has actually driven the direction of the game and been instrumental for the project. But it was born out of saying, I don't think I can pull off a stadium very early. Another aspect of restraint is emptiness. Sparse moments let the player's imagination work for you. It's amazing what they'll do if you give them the opportunity. As an example, we shut the lights off between rounds so we can change out the props, which gives the player a moment to just look at the stars. And it's been a happy accident, but being outside looking at the stars in the quiet is something a lot of players comment on. And I'll admit that when I first set it up, I laid on my back to look up, which was a little cumbersome with the HMD and the wires, but I did it anyway. So you can also make pointed emissions if you know the purpose of an asset. Here's one of our targets. This is not my finest moment as an artist. In fact, this is prototype art that I made in the first week of banging on this. But you know what? The purpose of this target is to get hit with the ball and react, and it does that just fine. You don't get too close to it. And this art is simple, readable, efficient, and does the job at offering a reactive target for the ball that uses physics, which is really the core of this game. So that does bring us to the heart, which is physicality. I believe base interactions need to be fun as a toy with no game motivation. And this is especially true in VR because players spend a lot of effort to test the simulation space and just play around. So if the player can interact with it and it's smaller than a bus, it should probably move when it's touched, even just a little. And don't forget that light and sound are physical, and people have built-in expectations that, if not met, can break immersion. Use real-time light, shadow, and positional audio where you can. Now, these points on physics aren't really optional in VR. If you look at the option to the right, it's obvious that the guy on the hinge is more compelling when you view it on the screen. But in VR, the guy on the left feels so fake that it breaks your sense of immersion and presence. So it's vital to spend the time to do physics setups on anything and everything that your player can interact with. And that obviously has a lot to do with how you can interact, whether it's a ball or hand controls or whatever. So not every game is about heading balls, but whatever your chosen mechanics, in VR, you should limit the ways your player can interact and alter the world state. Don't let your design write checks that your physics can't cash. In Headmaster, we never ask you to walk anywhere. We just put you in a spot, and while it's dark, and we start chucking balls at you. And all you've got is your head, so we're lucky. But you room scale hand control folks, you have to figure out how to keep things sane, or you're going to need a lot of resources and a big team to pull off player expectations. Now, plausibility is a partner to physicality, but they aren't the same thing. This is about topical believability, and it is something that you can actually decide. Help the player answer, what am I doing here? Can I fly? Can things move without me touching them? Headmaster uses soccer as a bridge between the real world and the game. And during this bridge phase, right at the beginning of the game, you're bringing the player from their world into yours. They're ready to learn the rules, and in those first moments, you're writing a contract with them. This contract with the player defines the rules of your space. You need to know them, even if the player doesn't realize they're there. Our contract prohibits the use of floating text or other bits of magic that would casually get included in video games, even sports ones. We have a scoreboard to show you why. We have the voice talking over a loudspeaker to give you direction. We keep things plausible so that later on, once they're comfortable and past the bridge phase, we can start to push the limits of the contract and do some pretty odd things that keep things interesting. Now, plausibility is not tied to objective realism. We float things in front of the player as they're picking items up. Now, this seems to work without raising any red flags because in Headmaster, conveniently, the player has no avatar and no hands. They don't even use a controller. The players seem to accept this because you're just ahead and it's been fine. Now, in Headmaster, keeping things plausible has even driven us to create character and narrative to explain who is building all of the insane things that you have to deal with. So the last principle of this is isolation. You need to remember that you've got them. There's nothing else competing for their attention in VR by their own choice. So when a player's in VR, they aren't going to just hit the home button and leave just like on an iPhone. So you can confidently ask them to do things that you would be afraid to do in regular games. So yeah, we have this character named Carl. He's the only employee of the Football Improvement Center, and he's not allowed to talk to you. We had this idea that he'd occasionally slip you notes that give you some idea of what is going on in this kind of confusing experience that you're going through. And at first, I was hesitant to have notes with words because, like reading in video games. But while in our playtesting, people love these things, and they love getting up near them. And we actually had one guy go and try and look behind the note and see what was written on the back. And all the while, I was worried that he wasn't going to want to read anything. So to wrap up, I want to show a clip that illustrates kind of where this can go, and in Headmaster, how adhering to these principles has allowed us to push the boundaries later on in the game.
Round 5. Begin. Your health is one of our priorities. All equipment has been carefully tested and poses absolutely no risk of harm if used properly.
Thank you.
Amazing. I would definitely want to be heading some soccer balls into bombs as much as possible. Now I'd like to welcome up Holden Link, who's he's at Turbo Button and was going to talk to you about his experiences working on mobile and all sorts of cool stuff. Can we have the sound from the computer muted for this next one? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Holden, and I'm from Turbo Button. Turbo Button is an indie team in Los Angeles making games like the Adventure Time platformer and Floor Plan for Gear VR. I'm here today to talk about a problem that I believe is plaguing VR developers, particularly mobile VR developers. It's one that most of us don't like to talk about, but with this being GDC, it's a place where we need to confront things that we're uncomfortable with. I'm talking, of course, about draw calls. Turbo Button uses Unity. I started using Unity because I didn't have a technical background, and Unity was the easiest way for me to make games on my own. I'm sure a lot of you started using Unity before you started working in VR also, and a lot of us got used to making games without having to worry a ton about performance. But the optimization needs of VR games threatens that style of development that we've been really comfortable with. Unity recently tried to soften the blow by renaming draw calls to set pass calls, and it's not fooling anybody. Turbo Button has made an incredible discovery, though, that I really am excited to share with you today. We figured out how to batch in Unity. There are a few people who laughed, and they're probably doing that to prevent themselves from crying. But we used to think of optimization as a technical thing for programmers to figure out once it was needed. But programmers, realistically, are the last people to touch assets. In that regard, relying on a programmer to optimize your VR game is like calling a firefighter after the buildings burn down. In reality, the secret to making everything work and turning optimization into a team effort and getting everybody on board with the requirements. And this is something that took us a little bit of time to get comfortable with as we moved working with the team. If you're not a graphics programmer and you've tried to read guides on Unity optimization, they might look something like this. They're mostly nonsensical and seem to contradict themselves all the time. We realized that this was the case for most of our team, and we all had like a vague understanding of some of these concepts, but we didn't really fully understand what batching was or even what we should be batching. A lot of it just seemed like magic. And magic is great when it just works, but it's really scary when you're relying on it and it breaks. So today, I'm going to go over some optimization concepts and show how they've come together through different disciplines in our games. First, let's take a step back. If a draw call is a mysterious thing to you, it doesn't have to be. All of our games use graphics APIs like DirectX or OpenGL, and a draw call happens every time your game has to tell one of those APIs to draw something. So when we say batching draw calls, we're just talking about filling each call with as much stuff as possible so that you don't need as many overall. Each separate material that you use will cost you at least one call, so you want to minimize your material count. It's kind of like filling a moving truck. You're just trying to fill it in whichever way lets you make as few trips as possible. If your team understands this, they can build your game's assets to take advantage of it. We've all heard about atlasing textures so that you get to share materials. And at first we thought this was something that we could do after we had made most of our assets, but really it helps a lot if you start when the asset's being designed. So going forward, if we know that an asset's going to have to be batched or put on an atlas, we make sure that all of its UV maps are constrained between 0 and 1 so that it doesn't bleed onto other textures in the atlas. It makes tiling textures a little bit more of a manual process, but it saves a lot of headaches later on. Our artists never work with Atlas versions of the assets. We always maintain a raw version alongside the Atlas version. And anytime there's a change to the raw one, we automatically regenerate our assets, our atlases. There's some really great tools for doing that process in Unity. We use one called Meshbaker, but I highly recommend that you check out what exists already because there's probably something that can work for your team. So why is all that extra work worth it? Well, Unity is actually not as broken as we all say it is on Twitter, and batching actually works. In this area of Adventure Time, because everything is atlased, the environment is just 2 draw calls per eye. We have one draw call for the static batched environment assets. We have another for our dynamic batched assets, and then the rest of the calls that you see there are from stuff like light maps and the internal Gear VR stuff like the eye textures. Generally, you only want to worry about batching your static objects and your small dynamic objects. There are some things that you simply can't batch, and that's okay. You just need to make sure that you know what those are so that you can plan for them. Pick your battles up front. For example, in Adventure Time, we knew that we'd always have some number of characters on screen that would need skin meshes and VFX, and that informed how complex we got with our environments. But it may also be possible for you to use dynamic batching to stretch what you get out of each draw call. This is another example where we have these butterflies, bees, and other bugs that fly around one of our levels. and they occasionally bounce into your face as the camera moves forward. They add depth between you and the character, and they were an important feature to us that helped make the game's world feel a little more alive. We split each one into smaller meshes so that each mesh is under 300 verts, which was the dynamic batch limit for the shader that we were using. They only use transform animation, no bones or skin meshes, and as a result, they get to share a draw call with our dynamic moving assets like the spinning platforms and other things. You can take this to the extreme if you really want to. There's a threshold where the batch will actually cost more than the draw call, but the point is that if you build stuff by the rules, it actually works. Our targets in Adventure Time were 20 to 30 draw calls in stereo for the environment, and at most we top out around 50 draw calls when we have tons of VFX and characters on screen. And we targeted those lower range estimates so that we would have room for computationally expensive stuff like our camera system and Jake's procedural stretchy body. So if you've done all of that optimization on draw calls, congratulations. They're probably not going to be a huge problem for you anymore. But you're probably now going to end up GPU bound because you have so much extra room to work with. So here's some ways you can work around that. You ideally only want to be drawing things that the player is seeing. So even if you can fit all of your assets on a single atlas, it doesn't mean that it's the best idea to do so. These are some of our atlases from Floorplan, our upcoming Gear VR game. The game takes place in an elevator, and players solve puzzles by moving items between different floors. We made it so that each floor has its own atlas, and then we put all the items that you can carry on another atlas. Even though the elevator would have fit on that same atlas, the elevator actually uses a different shader than those items, so we put it into its own separate atlas as well. It's also easy to get GPU bound with alpha transparency. The main things that make alpha expensive are fill rate and overdraw. That's when the texture is really big on screen, meaning that it's drawing over lots of other objects, and when alpha overlaps with other alpha. The cold breath effect on the left in Floorplan is comparable in terms of GPU cost to this room in Adventure Time on the right. And that's even though the scene on the right has more draw calls and more sources of alpha. That's simply because this breath effect has a lot of overlapping alpha in it, and it takes up the player's entire field of view and headset. So the point is, you really shouldn't be afraid to use alpha when designing VFX in your games, but you should be considering how the effect is going to be used, because that might actually be the most important part. Another place you might consider using alpha is within your skybox. Our sky in Adventure Time was a solid background color on the camera, combined with a bunch of sprites that batched on a single sheet for the clouds. We used a custom shader to force those sprites to draw behind all of the geometry in the level. So we ended up dealing with a single 1024 texture for our sky without any compression artifacts, and that was only 2 draw calls in stereo. Doing sprites with alpha like this has a bigger cost on the GPU, but it could be a better option than a traditional skybox, depending on what's limiting performance in your game. In our case, when we needed more out of the CPU and needed to make room there, this worked out well for us. The best way to make your GPU performance and draw call count completely unmanageable is to use real-time lighting. There's a lot of fancy things like physically based rendering and new lighting options going into Unity 5, and it's tempting to play with them. My advice is to ignore all of them, especially if you're targeting a mobile VR platform. Favor light maps and faked lighting solutions whenever you can. Your game will look a lot better in the end if you decide to do this from the start. It'll mean that you're baking all of your detail into textures when necessary, and that all of your assets are created to look the way that they're actually going to look when you ship. Keep in mind that your light maps will probably be uncompressed, and uncompressed textures will be really expensive on the GPU on mobile. You can make clever use of fog and camera background colors to create some cool effects that you might normally try to do with lights. In this level of Adventure Time, you begin outdoors and gradually go deeper into a cave. And as you go through this cave, we slowly fade the fog color to black, and then bring the camera far clip distance in a little bit closer. And it makes the level start feeling a little bit more claustrophobic and dark. One of the floors in Floorplan is a graveyard where it's raining, and we wanted to add this lightning flash effect. We're doing that by tweening the camera's background color, the fog color, and the ambient light color all at once over a short period of time. The only things in the scene that actually receive ambient light are the elevator and the skull. Everything else uses an unlit shader and ignores the ambient light altogether. I hope this gave you an idea of the processes that we've put in place for mobile VR development and how optimization is a lot easier when you do it as a team from the start. If you want to check out Floorplan or Adventure Time for yourself, you can do so in the Oculus booth later on this week. Thanks for your time, and for everybody watching online later, you can disregard at least half of what I just said because there are better ways to do it now. Thanks, and good luck.
Yes, I don't know if any of you have played the Adventure Time game, but that first moment when Jake just comes up right in your face, I was like, this is the cartoon. This is amazing. Now I'd like to introduce Eka, who's going to be talking to us about tiny worlds. Oh, and we can have the computer volume back up, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chandane Kanayaka. I'm an artist, designer, and game director at Uber Entertainment in Bellevue, Washington. I'm currently finishing up Wayward Sky, an adventure game for PlayStation VR that uses many of the techniques we will discuss. The genesis for Wayward Sky came out of an early VR demo that I experienced, played on idea of miniature worlds. The sense of dramatic scale you feel as a player is unique to VR. VR allows you to feel as tall as a giant looking down on ants, as well as feeling being an ant size looking up at a world of giants. Let's talk about how we work with the scale before VR. To make something appear larger than it is, a subject can be shot from a low angle, pointed upward at it. The relative scale and location of that subject in the frame emphasizes its scale. Atmospheric perspective, such as fog, conveys distance and height, showing a relationship of the subject to something human can understand, like scale of other humans or animals we're familiar with. Using animation timing and spacing principles to convey its relative speed and weight also help. There's a sense of insignificance when faced with something unknown that is much larger than ourselves, maybe even slight fear. But when we're faced with something much smaller in a miniature scale, we tend to have a very different feeling about it. Miniature objects evoke a sense of wonder, awe, and mystery. We start to imagine what it would be like to be in a part of this little world. What would it feel like if the characters were animated and interacted with each other? At this small scale, we can take in a lot more info at once and see relationships we wouldn't normally see at a regular scale. There's an important part of play and discovery that we forget as we get older. I remember watching both of my boys growing up as toddlers trying to figure out gravity, flinging food at walls, or dropping a toy from their high chair to see what kind of sound it makes. Seeing their eyes light up as they discover new sensation for the first time was sheer joy for me as a parent after I cleaned up their mess. As adults, we forget the simple joy of seeing something new for the first time or feeling the texture of something. Or the joy of just throwing stuff to see what kind of sound they make. The moment that I was completely bought into VR was with an early Valve demo that eventually turned into what you see here, Aperture Science Robot Repair. I felt like a cubicle god looming over my subjects. All these little busy cubicle paper workers going about their day, drinking coffee, typing on keyboards. Never expected anything like it. Never experienced anything like it. A miniature set with so much detail at that scale was incredible. So of course, the first thing I wanted to do was sweep my hand across the whole office and cause chaos. I don't understand the little people problem in this weird thing in VR where tiny people are really cool looking. It sounds like kind of an absurd thing, but what it means is my conceptual model of why VR works has no explanation for why things at this certain scale level seem so much more compelling than other things. That's a quote from Gabe. Around the time of last year's GDC when they announced the Vive. Incidentally, I did email him to ask his permission, and he replied with sure. I was like, happy to stay. After seeing the Valve demo, I knew I wanted to make a tabletop scale VR game. In mid-2014, I started to experiment with ideas that would eventually become Wayward Sky. I was prototyping with a Gear VR, which has 3 degrees of movement and a touchpad built into the headset. The base locomotion of the game came out of the constraint of the Gear VR. The player looks down on a miniature environment, taps the trackpad on the Gear VR to move a character on the spot. And just like that, a look-and-click adventure game was born. After the initial prototype, we decided to switch platforms to PlayStation VR. This allowed us to focus more on visual fidelity, details to give the world more weight, and all the things that Holden said not to use, we're using. We use fog, lighting, shadows to aid in focusing the player to elements we want them to interact with. Positional tracking allows the player to look around corners, appear over obstacles, and examine points of interest. Because the player can be looking anywhere, we use supporting architectural elements to pull the viewer's gaze back to important elements. Switching to PlayStation VR also meant we had access to not only positional tracking, but motion controls as well. Instead of looking around and clicking a button to drive the character, we give the player a motion-controlled pointer to direct the character. We wanted to have a greater miniature feel, so the camera was scaled by a factor of 10 to make the world feel smaller and player feel bigger. This leaves the head free to explore, look around the world, or lean in and check out details, while the character is moving to their destination. There are moments in the game where the main character walks up to points of interest, and we switch to a first-person view to focus on puzzle interaction. As we do this, we change the scale of the player camera from 10x to 1x. The world is built to this real scale so they can be manipulated by the player. Suddenly, the surrounding feels very different at this scale. The laser pointer from the third-person view is changed to hands the player can use to reach out and solve puzzles or interact with other objects in the space. Again, it's hard to convey the scale change in screenshots, but let's try. For third-person avatar exploration, the player camera is scaled to the point where the player feels like a 50-foot giant. This is done by adding a scale transform to the parent object that the game camera is a child of in Unity in this example. Positional tracking at this scale lets the player cover a lot more ground. Certain hotspots in puzzle go into first-person view where we change the camera scale back to 1. 1x scale is what first-person VR games use, and this makes you feel like you're in the world at Bess's scale, the main character. The next problem we had to solve was locomotion. As Bess, the main character, walks through the world and enters camera triggers, we do a quick fade transition and switch to different fixed cameras along her path. For this to work, there needs to be a visual continuity as to not to confuse the player. We try to keep Bess in a frame at all times in between cuts. We also minimize the angle change between cameras, usually nothing over 90 degrees. For visual interest and mood, the camera's distance to the character can be placed depending on what we want the player to see. It's true in VR the player can be looking anywhere, but we've also found that players like to have their head in a comfortable position for a seated VR experience. During early testing, we found players wanted to just look straight ahead, so we used certain visual and auditory cues to encourage them to look around the environment and explore their periphery. Motion with positional sound across their view tends to work best. For primary game-related goals, we don't ask the player to look at extreme angles from their head neutral position. We don't want to fatigue the player and try to design for comfort. We've also noticed that sense of 3D-ness tends to flatten out after about 20 meters, so the players get comfortable being in VR, they tend to explore more. We don't design any core gameplay interactions past 77 degrees or so on each side of the player. Anything beyond that is a decoration and eye candy. We don't require the player to look up past 60 degrees or look down more than 40 degrees. Anything within a half a meter of the player's head starts to feel uncomfortable and too close to focus on. For camera cuts, the center of the view of the new camera is always used. Recently, we've started on a new prototype to show off tabletop scale. For navigation and exploration, we use a single motion controller to grab and pan around the world. We use both hands to stretch, zoom, and zoom out, as well as rotate the tabletop. As you zoom, we scale the player camera from 1x to 140 times bigger to go from being in the world to making it feel like a miniature set. During the rotator zoom, we also draw a fixed grid reference point to prevent any motion sickness. The skybox and mountains are also fixed to aid in comfort. This prototype is themed around a world of Western frontier settlers and dinosaurs. We built a sandbox version first to see if the players would interact with the world. During playtesting, some went straight to picking up a settler and throwing them in the fire, or feeding a T-Rex, or just chucking them as hard as they could, see if they can hit the mountains. We wanted to make sure if the player sees something interesting, there's some sort of feedback. Whether it's running your hands across the trees, or assigning settlers to gather resources, or riding a raptor, we want to support it. Delightful interaction was the goal of this prototype. I would love to see more developers use tabletop scale VR techniques in their games. 3D platformers translate really well in this format. You get a much greater sense of timing jumps and to be able to see gaps better in VR compared with 2D screens. Tower defense games like Air Mech and Defense Grid 2 work well in VR. Controlling small armies of robots is fun at this scale. Camera movement is going to be tricky, depending on how it's done. I prefer teleportation blinks or giving the player a point of reference object as they move around the world. To recap, dynamic scale can be a powerful tool in VR, going from being immersed in a space to feeling like a giant looking into the same space. Third-person avatar locomotion with camera blinks work well for exploring big environments. Designing your world and interaction so the player doesn't fatigue after extended play sessions. How can you bring joy to your players? Allow them to play with and have fun in VR interactions. And please, please, won't some of you make some more table scale VR games? Thank you.
Yes, and our final speaker for the Microtalks is Teresa Duringer. Who's going to be sharing some great stuff with us. Let's welcome Teresa.
Kind of short. Yep, I'm Teresa Duringer. You may remember me from such games as Cannon Brawl and Spore. Today I'm going to be taking you on a little trip back to the 90s. So remember GeoCities, Remember blink tags and animated GIFs and scrolling marquees everywhere? It was pretty cringy. Well, right now, I think that VR design and development is kind of in a GeoCities moment, present company excluded. So the point of all that stuff was to draw the user's attention to a feature on the website that the developer wanted them to engage in. This was largely resolved with standardization. So eventually, you had the login UI, for example, always in the upper right-hand corner. And this reduced the need for the developer to engage in some of these cheesy attraction techniques. In VR, we don't have those standards yet. So what I'm seeing is a lot of gimmicky, over-complex design, including in my own body of work. But we're getting there. So if you remember things like guest books, those eventually became comments, became Reddit, became Facebook, or things like animated construction GIFs. Those became beta tags, became move fast and break things, became that's just how the internet works. In VR, we're also generating this pool of features that's going to evolve so that we can move out of this development 1.0. I'd say at least 80% of my playtesters are what I call VRgens. They've never played in VR before. So that means that not only does the developer have to tutorialize the game, they also have to tutorialize the platform, and that's a lot of work. So there's this lack of established relationship between the player and the medium. If you think about something like Xbox, the A button means action always, or the B button means back, or if you're on PC, space is fire, or jump. In VR, we just don't have these standards, partially because the input systems are coming from fragmented companies. So you need to tutorialize everything. But tutorials are largely visual. So how do you get people to attend to a specific target? This issue is amplified in VR because there's 360 degrees of visual freedom. So if you want them to look at something over here for a cinematic or tutorial, and they're looking over here, how do you resolve that? So there's some visual tricks that I think people are starting to do to manage attentional manipulation. So one trick that I've done in a game that I made is I spawn this shooting star in front of you. And that's something that I can use to guide the user to look in the direction I want them to look in. So this is this kind of flashy particle effect thing. Sometimes there's animated textures. And it can get to be loud if you add a lot of these sort of noisy visual things. And if that sounds kind of familiar, it sort of reminds me of some of the visual clutter of things like spinning new animations, or spinning hit tickers. And you can keep on adding more and more of these to your application or game. So some of the tricks in my own body of work are this shooting star. Also, you can have the NPC make eye contact with the camera, and then look somewhere else, and players will naturally follow the gaze. You can, I have a monoscopic experience in one of my games where you're looking down the barrel of a telescope, so that can kind of guide your vision. Or if you want to use manipulate the player's vision in an orthogonal direction, you can use some of these peripheral edge effects. Or in general, you can just add animation. So I've got this monkey and some animated text or some animated visual effects, text effects, things like that. The problem is, you might think you're going to be making this on the left, Minority Report. That's what everyone wants to make in VR. But what you actually end up making is more akin to Jesse's skiing page circa 1996. And that's because no one knows how to interact with the thing on the left. It might look pretty, and it's not that hard to make, but there's just not that language of interaction yet. So what ends up happening is you play test, and you add a feature to try to sell the interaction. Some people get it. You add another feature to get the rest of the people. And you can just add more and more and more. So eventually, you get kind of a mess. So all the tricks I've been talking about so far have been in the service of guiding attention. I want to talk about one more trick, which was the quintessential, most cringy feature of the 90s web development, which was the blink tag. And I think that this wasn't just about your attention. It wasn't just about emphasis, because you had other tools like font weight and layout. I think a part of this was pure novelty. I think that's why it got abused so much. So that brings me to Jurassic Park. I really love this quote from Jeff Goldblum. "You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should." And I think that applies to a lot of what I'm seeing in VR design right now. So I'm going to talk about my own stuff to not piss people off. I think it can be really tempting to start designing for VR by saying, I'm going to play to the strengths of VR. What can you do exclusively in VR? But I think that can take you down some rabbit holes. So for example, you have yaw, pitch, and roll data from your accelerometer. One thing I did in one of my games is added a nodding and shaking your head input system for accepting or rejecting a quest. I thought it was really cool, but the problem is, through playtests, there was a really wide range of what behavior people would take when you asked them to nod their head. At least half the people did this. And then there was like a swooping nod. There was all kinds. And if I have my code sort of accept this really wide range, you get a lot of false positives. So that's a pretty bad experience. Another thing that I did, just because I could, is I put the UI in my game in the sky. And I thought, this is this really cool swath of real estate. I've never been able to take advantage of it in a game before. And it's literally a heads-up display. Like, I thought it was going to be really cool. And it was cool, you know, but it was also really uncomfortable for people. That's something they're going to be accessing all the time, and it's just not comfortable to crane your neck at that angle. And additionally, I had to really sell the interaction. I used the shooting star thing. You know, I had this glittering dendritic structure in the sky. That was your mini-map. It turns out if you just draw a map where someone expects it to be, that's a lot more effective. I don't think these mistakes are bad. So right now we're kind of in the adolescence of VR. We have a lot of enthusiasm, but maybe not as much expertise. But we're in this awkward but necessary step of growth in this new medium. And I want to challenge everyone to step back in their design and think about what problem you're actually solving. So I was at Oculus when I first started in VR, and I did a demo, and it was so compelling that I wanted to step forward and explore the world. But I bumped into a coffee table. So I thought about that, and I ended up designing my game around this solution, this flying carpet. It's something that gives you that satisfaction of exploration, but you also inherently know to plant your feet in one spot. And once you start coming up with design solutions like this, other mechanics will fall out. You'll figure out what your world looks like, because there are a lot of variables to tackle in VR. And that's because we have a loss of abstraction. So if you think about some of the original computer games, like Minesweeper or Pong, those were super abstract. They were circles and squares. They were symbols. But in VR, you're frequently in first person. And there are a lot of implications from that. One is that you'll have perspective. Another is that you have a sky. What does the sky look like? You have to draw something if people look up. What did the sky look like in Minesweeper? They didn't have to deal with that. Because of this, there's this forced relative realism. So I'm not just talking about a realistic aesthetic here. I'm talking about a one-to-one relationship between the player and the game world. So for example, if you see some reflective surface in the game, you're going to expect that you're going to see your reflection back. And that means the developer is tasked with coming up with what does the avatar look like. Back with Minesweeper and Pong, you didn't have to think about what the avatar looks like. So there's just a lot of variables that the developers have to fill in, and I think if you don't do those really cleanly and smartly, it can get kind of cacophonous. A little bit of this mess is also amplified, I'd say, by the kind of people who tend to gravitate towards VR. With this really new field, I think we're inherently tinkerers, we're experimenters. We like to try lots of new things. You might not describe us as the kind of people who are full of restraint and minimalism, but that's okay. Because what we're doing right now is we're generating the pool of techniques and mechanics that we're going to derive those standards from. And again, once we have the standards, the cleaner elegance is going to fall out. So just remember, nothing in VR is too obvious. Avoid useless novelties. Don't design for what VR can do. Design to solve the problems, because there are a lot of problems. But we're getting there. Thanks.
Great. So how are we doing on time? Do we have like 10 minutes to do some Q&A? So-so? Can we do a couple questions? Yeah, if you want to line up at the microphones, then we're happy to take some questions. But I mean, let's give another round of applause to all the panelists. Like, we had some really cool stuff here today, yeah? Thank you. And thank you for being here. Any questions, you're welcome at the microphone. Otherwise, just email us. Here are our email addresses. We're findable on the internet.
Hi, Hi, thanks for the great presentations. You mentioned about standardization across the devices, and is there any effort underway for that?
Is there any effort underway for what?
For standardization of your user interface or anything in the VR platforms?
Teresa, do you want to take that one?
Does this work? I can't tell. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Can you repeat the question?
I think that I don't know. I think that every HMD manufacturer has started investing in their own particular input system, and there is such a variety. I'm seeing wands, I'm seeing gamepads, some people use trackpads, some people use keyboard. And honestly, the more that I see VR getting to be a hot topic that everyone's excited about, the more variety I'm seeing with startups of input. I think that will probably slow down and curve off, but right now I'm seeing the opposite direction.
Yes?
This question is probably too loaded, but which of the headsets did you guys each pre-order?
Oh, the question is, which of the headsets did each of us pre-order?
Yeah.
Well, definitely the ones that we're working with.
I didn't pre-order any of them. We have all of them. So.
For personal.
Honest answer.
Personal use.
Gear VR for me. Otherwise, I have them all already too.
Yeah, as an indie, there's no difference between my personal and my work stuff, and I have all of them.
Yes? Oh, I think we're done. Thank you, everybody. And there's another Microtalks session, if you like the format, 4 p.m. on Thursday in room 135 at the North Hall. It's called Everyone Loves to Play. Thanks again.
Thank you.